During World War II, German soldiers always said, "Take advantage of an opportunity when you have it, otherwise you may not get it." So when the opportunity to go on vacation came up, I didn't put it off. The leave started on November 16, 1942 from the positions of the regiment west of Stalingrad. I had a long way to go, and then took a train to Germany. And as it turned out later, I left Stalingrad just in time. At one of the railroad stations I heard about the Russian counteroffensive, directed at the Romanian and Italian sectors of the front. People were skeptical. The Russians used their knowledge of the Winter War and attacked us at our weakest points. Also, the British-American air raids were a tangible blow, more than officially recognized. After a few days on the road, rumors about Stalingrad began to reach me. It was said that the city was surrounded by Russians who had broken through the Romanians and Italians. Their defenses had simply dissolved. But then I and other military men from Stalingrad argued vehemently. We were sure that this was a lie, since the city was firmly held in German hands, except for a narrow strip along the Volga at the northern edge. We had no worries. But when I arrived home, people were already talking openly about the superiority of the Russians in the art of winter warfare, about the great offensive that had encircled our army. The war reports on the radio were almost all from there. I couldn't believe it. When I left, the situation seemed stable. I didn't want to believe it, and I didn't want the rumors to spoil my mood at home. I decided that I would sort everything out later when I returned to Stalingrad. The days of vacation, unfortunately, flew by very quickly, but they were the best days of my life. It was time to return to the front. On the train I sat opposite a young lieutenant from the general staff. When he heard that I was going to return to Stalingrad, he said, "You will not come back from there in one piece. Stalingrad is surrounded, and it's not good there." That was the first reliable information. The press and radio fed us nonsense in abundance. Solid feats, accomplished in spite of everything. The road to Stalino went smoothly. There we, vacationers returning to Stalingrad, were gathered in barracks for a few days. After Christmas we were transferred to Rostov, to the Personnel Distribution Center. Here every day there was a verification ceremony. To begin with, officers from infantry, sapper and anti-tank units were selected and ordered to leave for the newly formed fire units. These units were formed from soldiers who arrived from leave. At the front, things were bad. Romanian and Italian units were defeated and fled. The Luftwaffe field divisions did not show themselves any better. This was one of Reichsmarschall Goring's ideas because of the lack of fuel and airplanes and the general situation at the front. Young, combat-ready Luftwaffe personnel were being assembled and sent to the front. However, Goring from the beginning was not going to give the army the leadership of these units. His units were given to the army in pieces as replenishment. He wanted to have his own divisions, like Himmler's Waffen-SS, so he could show the army how to fight. These inexperienced troops performed at their worst at the front. Their casualty rate was nightmarish. Only the anti-aircraft units were familiar with their weapons because they already had some experience in ground combat and had proven themselves against tanks. They were more successful, but often bled to death covering the withdrawal of their useless divisions. It was easy for me to guess that as an artilleryman I could fall into one of these hastily formed rabble units and be sent on a suicide mission. With no chance of success, there would be nothing left to lose. Finally, I was lucky. I was given a package of courier mail for the leadership of the army in Gumrak, and having received an airplane ticket I could fly to Stalingrad. And in general, any reasonable assessment of the situation in the encirclement would have led to a complete cessation of such flights, bringing new people to the city. There were already enough people there who had to endure the lack of food and ammunition. The high-level headquarters had no picture of what was going on, and no clear idea of the present state of affairs. They issued orders, shrugged their shoulders, stuck in colored pins noting the gradually deteriorating situation at the front, and moved divisions around on paper. I did not know at the time that the army group, including Paulus's encircled 6th Army, was commanded by Field Marshal von Manstein. After the war, Manstein portrayed himself as a great military leader, but he barely mentioned Stalingrad. He tried to blame everything on Paulus, although he himself gave no clear instructions when Paulus asked him to. Hitler was against the breakthrough. He didn't want to surrender because he had already almost taken the city back in September and gained control of the Volga. Paulus was following Hitler's lead. The field marshal should have shown more courage, especially when it came to the life and death of his troops. The lives of soldiers were not the most important thing to Hitler when he thought about the future. Goring was largely to blame for the disaster at Stalingrad. He could not fulfill his promise to airlift as many supplies as were needed, and he knew it even before he promised. He had degenerated into a pompous, drug-addled wastrel. Climbing into a U-52 transport plane at the Rostov airfield, I had to squeeze past a large box with a paper sticker reading, "Christmas greetings to the commander of the Stalingrad fortress, Generaloberst Paulus." I found the inscription tasteless and inappropriate. To me, a fortress is a carefully laid-out defensive position with safe shelters and suitable defensive armament, as well as sufficient supplies. Stalingrad had none of that. All in all, Stalingrad was a mess that should have been cleaned up as soon as possible. I think the box contained booze and snacks for the big ranks. Now that the encircled troops were starving, this broad gesture was out of place, was impermissible, and even provoked disobedience. The plane flew over the snow-covered fields, slowly gaining altitude, then dropping down like an elevator, repeating all this over and over again. I saw burning barns, houses, and thick smoke from burning oil tanks. "This is Tatsinskaya Station," said the pilot. "The airfield from where Stalingrad is supplied. We call it Tatsi. The Russians recently rolled us with their damn tanks, the whole airfield and everything around it. But now we've beaten it back." Soon we landed at Morozovskaya, another supply airfield. The Russians were close here too. Artillery fire and the barking of tank guns could be heard. On the airfield, bombs were being hung from bombers and fighters. In the distance were heard bursts. Everyone around us was nervous. The first thing we wanted to do was to get warm, find something to eat, and then find out how to get to Stalingrad. Since ours were going to leave the airfield, you could take as much winter clothing and food as you wanted. I provided myself with winter uniforms, felt boots and satchels, which I stuffed with bread and canned food as a small gift to the guys from my unit. There was real hunger there in the encirclement, although there were rumors going around that we had broken through the encirclement. The Russians were fleeing like before. I wanted to believe it, especially after seeing the confident troops, but the truth, unknown to me at the time, would have discouraged me and probably kept me from flying to Stalingrad. During the next day I tried several times to fly to Stalingrad. First, our overloaded plane broke down on the runway and we had to find other transportation. The next airplane took off and flew to the Don and ran into Russian fighter planes, which drove us back into the clouds and we had to return. The third takeoff and flight was more successful, but landing at the airfield was not possible. When landing, the left wheel got into a crater in the frozen ground, and the pilot could hardly get the machine in the air again. Now it was a question of landing on the belly, but not here, at the local airfield Potomnik inside the encirclement ring, but in Morozovskaya. Who knows what would happen if one tried to land here? The other wheel, or rather its strut, was jammed. It could not be released manually. In Morozovsk, they landed on their belly. The entire left wing, including the engine, was torn off, the lower nacelle was crumpled, and the front glass dome was broken. But we were unharmed and the airplane did not catch fire. As expected, the Heinkel skidded on the ice and then broke apart. We were damn lucky again. This time death came very close. During the night, frantic activity boiled over. Restlessness, shouting, slamming doors, the noise of engines. The airfield was evacuated because the Russians were attacking and were close. Everything that could be tied up and thrown into the backs of trucks. I picked up some delicacies, including French cognac, and started asking about the next flight to Stalingrad. I was lucky to find a seat in a small airplane, a low-end monoplane with 2 seats and an open cockpit. It took me to Rostov, from there on a transport plane to Salsk, There I found a place in a Junkers flying to picnic. Finally I arrived at the Stalingrad cauldron. Hatches opened, I climbed out on the wing, said goodbye to the crew and looked around. Ragged, poorly dressed wounded soldiers were walking towards us, stumbling across the strip. They were desperately trying to get on the plane and fly away. But the pilots had already closed the hatches, and all 3 engines roared. Shouts, commands, someone's words, "We don't want to stay here forever," were the last thing I heard from the pilots. The engines roared and the airplane moved from the ground. They took off on their own initiative, without any instructions and without contacting the flight control center. The plane disappeared into the darkness, and the screaming wounded who had tried more than once to cling to the airplane disappeared as well. A few of them were crawling in the snow on all fours, cursing and crying. They were dirty, unkempt, overgrown with beards, exhausted, wearing blood-soaked bandages, wrapped in rags like gypsies and utterly oblivious of discipline. There were no military police or medics around as far as the eye could see. I had never seen such chaos in the Wehrmacht before. It must have looked like Napoleon's defeated army at the Berezina. I felt a mixture of horror and compassion. I felt abandoned and thought, "You'd be better off staying outside rather than insisting on getting in here." If I went to the emergency room, I could wait for developments. I wandered around and finally found a deep dugout with an entrance curtained off with a cloak tent. I crawled into the dugout where I was greeted by the stench of unwashed bodies and leftover food. I was greeted with hostility. And when I described my adventures, I was laughed at. One staff sergeant said, "You must be out of your mind. You're in the shit now, just like the rest of us. Return tickets are only for wounded, headless, legless and so on, and you have to find a plane." It was just a disastrous end to the vacation. How good it was at the beginning, how awful it was at the end. To say the least, there was absolute chaos in the nursery. No one was giving clear orders to anyone, and helpless, desperate wounded were lying and wandering anywhere. I asked myself again and again whether it was smart to return to Stalingrad. I tried to shake off the gloomy thoughts. My faith in the German leadership had not yet crumbled completely. Dead tired, I soon fell asleep.